I'm a neurosurgeon, or at least I was, in the traditional sense of the word, until about 5 years ago when I made the decision to transition almost entirely into research and teaching. You can call me Dr. Stephen Wallace if you want, though most of my colleagues at the University of Arkansas Medical Center in Little Rock just knew me as the brain guy during my 2 decades in the operating room. I've performed over 3,000 craniotomies, removed hundreds of tumors, clipped countless aneurysms, and relieved pressure from more traumatic brain injuries than I care to remember. I've held human brains in my hands, seen them at their most vulnerable, and developed what I thought was a pretty comprehensive understanding of what this 3-pound organ can and cannot do. But there's one case that has haunted me for the past 20 years. One patient whose outcome defied every principle of neuroscience I learned in medical school, residency, and 2 decades of surgical practice. A case that forced me to fundamentally question whether we really understand consciousness at all, or if we're just pretending to have answers while fumbling around in the dark. The case I'm about to tell you about is that of Terry Wallace, and it represents the single most inexplicable recovery I have ever witnessed in my entire career. The University of Arkansas Medical Center serves a large rural population across the state, and we frequently receive transfers from smaller community hospitals when cases exceed their capabilities. We're also a major trauma center, so we see the worst of the worst when it comes to motor vehicle accidents, farm equipment injuries, and other catastrophic trauma that characterizes life in rural America. Terry's case actually began long before I ever met him. It started on July 13, 1984, in Stone County, Arkansas, deep in the Ozark Mountains. Terry was 20 years old, working as an auto mechanic in the small community of Big Flat. He was young, energetic, and according to his family, lived life on the edge, doing whatever he could to enjoy every moment. Just 6 weeks earlier, he had become a father when his wife Sandy gave birth to their daughter, Amber. He was a new dad with his whole life ahead of him. On that July evening, Terry was driving his white Chevy LV pickup truck with a friend as a passenger, heading along a rural road near Marshall. These are the kinds of roads that wind through the Ozarks, narrow and twisting, with small bridges crossing creeks and ravines. Exactly what happened remains somewhat unclear, but witnesses and investigators believe Terry may have overcorrected or lost control. The truck smashed through a railing fence on a small bridge and skidded over the edge. The vehicle plummeted 25 feet down into a dry creek bed below. It landed upside down in the rocky ravine. They weren't found until the next morning. When emergency responders finally reached the overturned truck, they found Terry's friend dead at the scene. Terry himself was still alive, but barely. He was unresponsive, not breathing adequately on his own, with massive head trauma and what appeared to be a broken neck. The paramedics intubated him on the spot and rushed him to the nearest hospital with trauma capabilities. The initial CT scans showed what we call diffuse axonal injury, one of the most severe forms of traumatic brain injury. When the brain is subjected to rapid acceleration and deceleration forces like those experienced in a high-impact crash, the nerve fibers throughout the brain can be stretched, twisted, and torn. Unlike a localized brain injury where damage is confined to one area, diffuse axonal injury affects the brain globally, disrupting the communication pathways between different brain regions. Terry also had significant brainstem injury and was completely tetraplegic, unable to move any of his limbs. The neurosurgeon who first evaluated him gave the family the grim prognosis that we're trained to deliver in these circumstances. If he survives at all, he will likely remain in a persistent vegetative state for the rest of his life. But Terry did survive the acute phase. After several weeks in intensive care, he stabilized enough to be taken off the ventilator. His brainstem function was intact enough that he could breathe on his own. But that was about the only encouraging sign. He remained completely unresponsive to verbal commands, showed no purposeful movements, and displayed no signs of awareness of his surroundings. Within a year, Terry's condition was classified as a minimally conscious state, though this diagnosis didn't formally exist yet in 1984. He would occasionally grunt, make small movements, or seem to track objects with his eyes for brief moments. But these responses were inconsistent and could easily be interpreted as reflexive rather than conscious. The doctors told the family what I would have told them. Meaningful recovery was virtually impossible. After this length of time with this severity of injury, the brain simply doesn't heal. Terry was transferred to Stone County Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Mountain View, Arkansas, where he would spend the next 19 years. I first learned about Terry's case in 1995, about 11 years after his accident. I had recently joined the faculty at UAMS after completing my fellowship, and I was asked to consult on several long-term care patients in the region who had been in vegetative or minimally conscious states for extended periods. The consultations were primarily to assess whether there had been any neurological changes and to help families understand the medical reality of their loved one's conditions. I drove out to Mountain View to examine Terry. He was 31 years old at the time, though he had been essentially frozen at age 20 for over a decade. I reviewed his medical records, studied his brain imaging from the acute injury phase, and examined him personally. What I found was exactly what I expected given his history. Terry showed some spontaneous movements of his eyes, occasionally grimaced, and would sometimes make grunting sounds. When I squeezed his hand, I felt what might have been a slight pressure in response, but it was impossible to determine if this was voluntary or simply a reflexive grasp. His EEG showed sleep-wake cycles, which indicated his brainstem was functioning, but there was no evidence of higher-level cognitive processing or conscious awareness. I examined his brain scans with particular attention. The original CT scans from 1984 showed the diffuse axonal injury clearly, along with damage to the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. There was also evidence of injury to the thalamus, which acts as a relay station for sensory information, and to various regions of the cerebral cortex. The family, particularly his mother Angelie and father Jerry, insisted that Terry was aware and responsive. They told me he would blink in response to questions, that he seemed more alert when they played country music for him, and that he recognized family members when they visited. They had never given up on him. They brought him home on alternate weekends, took him down to the creek, even took him hunting, because those were things he had enjoyed before the accident. I listened respectfully, but internally, I was skeptical. In my experience, families of long-term vegetative patients almost always believe they see signs of consciousness that aren't really there. It's a natural human response to want to find meaning and connection, to interpret random movements as purposeful communication. The brain is pattern-seeking, and we tend to see what we want to see. I delivered my assessment to the family as gently as I could. I told them that while Terry showed some minimal responses, there was no evidence of conscious awareness. I explained that after 11 years, the chances of meaningful recovery were essentially zero. I encouraged them to continue providing comfort care and to cherish whatever time they had with him, but I did not give them false hope. That was my last direct involvement with Terry's case until June 2003. I was in my office at UAMS reviewing surgical cases when I received a phone call from a colleague in Mountain View who sounded absolutely stunned. He told me that Terry Wallace, the long-term, minimally conscious patient I had consulted on years earlier, had started talking. I thought it was a joke. I asked him to repeat himself. He wasn't joking. He told me that a nurse had been in Terry's room that morning when Terry had suddenly said the word, "Mama." The nurse thought she had imagined it, but then Terry had said it again. Within minutes, Terry was asking for Pepsi, then milk, and then he was having actual conversations. I didn't believe it. It was medically impossible. Patients don't wake up after 19 years of minimal consciousness. The brain doesn't work that way. I pulled up Terry's file on my computer and reviewed his case history again, looking for any detail I might have missed. Had there been some progression I hadn't noticed? Some subtle improvement documented in recent nursing notes? But there was nothing. The most recent assessment from just 3 months earlier described the same minimal responses I had observed 8 years ago. No changes, no improvements, no reason whatsoever to expect any kind of recovery. I called the nursing home back and asked to speak with the nurse who had first heard Terry speak. She was a veteran nurse with over 20 years of experience in long-term care. She wasn't the type to get excited over random sounds or misinterpret reflexive vocalizations. She told me that Terry had said "mama" clearly and distinctly, twice, while looking directly at his mother. Then he had asked for Pepsi, his favorite drink. The nurse said she had nearly dropped the medication cup she was holding. I canceled my afternoon surgeries and drove to Mountain View immediately. The 2-hour drive felt endless. My mind was racing with possible explanations, each more unlikely than the last. Perhaps he had been having intermittent periods of consciousness all along that no one had documented. Perhaps there was some environmental change at the facility that had triggered a neurological response. Perhaps the original diagnosis had been wrong, and he had been in a locked-in state all this time, conscious but completely unable to move or communicate. But none of these explanations made sense with what I knew about his case. When I arrived at Stone County Nursing and Rehabilitation Center, I found the entire staff buzzing with excitement and disbelief. Several nurses who had cared for Terry for years were openly crying. The social director, Alicia Badgley, met me at the entrance and led me to Terry's room. She told me that in the few hours since he had started talking, Terry had become increasingly verbal. He was asking questions, expressing preferences, making jokes. It was as if 19 years of stored thoughts were suddenly pouring out. I walked into Terry's room. I genuinely expected to find some mistake, some misunderstanding. Perhaps he had regained some automatic speech, but wasn't truly conscious. Perhaps this was some form of confabulation or perseveration that mimicked conversation without genuine understanding. But there was Terry Wallace, sitting in his wheelchair, having a conversation with his mother. He saw me enter the room and turned his head slightly to look at me, something he had never been able to do before. His mother introduced me, explaining I was one of the doctors who had examined him years ago. Terry's speech was slow and somewhat slurred, what we call dysarthria, a motor speech disorder. But he was clearly forming words, expressing thoughts, and responding appropriately to what was being said to him. He wasn't making random sounds or exhibiting echolalia. He was having genuine, meaningful conversations. I stood there absolutely dumbfounded. I asked Terry simple questions to assess his cognitive function. I asked him his name. Terry Wallace, he responded clearly. I asked him if he knew where he was. He seemed confused by the question and said he wasn't sure. I asked him what year it was. 1984, he said. It's 1984, right? I felt chills run down my spine. Terry believed no time had passed at all. He thought Ronald Reagan was still president. He asked to call his grandmother, not knowing she had died years earlier. He asked where his friend was, the one who had been killed in the crash. He wanted to know why everyone looked so old. As far as Terry's conscious experience was concerned, he had left in 1984 and woken up in what he thought was later that same year. 19 years had simply vanished from his life. I spent several hours with Terry that day, conducting as thorough a neurological examination as I could under the circumstances. His motor function was still severely limited. He remained quadriplegic and wheelchair-bound. But cognitively, he was present. He could recall memories from before the accident with clarity. He recognized his family members, though he was confused about why they had aged so much. He could follow complex conversations and express his thoughts coherently, even with his speech difficulties. Over the next few days, Terry's improvement continued. His vocabulary expanded rapidly. By day 3, according to the nursing staff, He was talking almost non-stop, asking questions about everything that had happened during the years he had been minimally conscious. He had no memories of that period whatsoever. As far as his subjective experience was concerned, those 19 years had never happened. I was professionally obligated to find a neurological explanation for what I was witnessing, but I was completely at a loss. This should not have been possible. Patients with Terry's severity and duration of injury do not recover. Full stop. That's not pessimism or medical conservatism. That's based on decades of research and thousands of documented cases. I arranged for Terry to be transferred to UAMS for comprehensive evaluation. We needed to understand what had happened, and more importantly, why it had happened after 19 years. In 2004, through contacts in the research community, I helped coordinate for Terry and his family to travel to New York to see Dr. Nicholas Schiff and his team at Weill Cornell Medical College. Dr. Schiff was one of the leading researchers in disorders of consciousness, and he had access to advanced brain imaging technology that we didn't have in Arkansas. If anyone could explain Terry's recovery, it would be his team. The imaging studies that Dr. Schiff's team conducted were, in a word, stunning. They used a relatively new technique called diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI, which allows you to visualize the white matter tracts in the brain. These are the bundles of axons that serve as the communication highways between different brain regions. Traditional CT and MRI scans show you the structure of the brain, but DTI shows you the connections. What the scans revealed was both expected and completely unprecedented. The expected part was that Terry's brain showed profound damage. Compared to healthy control subjects, his white matter tracts were severely degenerated throughout the brain. The diffuse axonal injury from the 1984 accident had caused widespread destruction that was still clearly visible 2 decades later. By all rights, a brain with this much damage should not have been capable of the kind of consciousness and communication that Terry was demonstrating. But here's the unprecedented part. The scans also showed something extraordinary. There were areas of Terry's brain, particularly in the posterior regions, where the white matter appeared to be abnormally thick and organized. These weren't normal neural pathways. These appeared to be new connections that had grown over time, bypassing the damaged areas and creating alternative routes for neural communication. Dr. Schiff's team performed a second set of scans 18 months later. The comparison was remarkable. Areas of new growth that had been present in the first scan had become even more pronounced. Furthermore, there was now evidence of new connections forming in the cerebellum, a region involved in motor control. This correlated with modest improvements in Terry's motor function during that same period. He had regained some limited movement in his previously paralyzed limbs. The theory that emerged from this research was that Terry's brain had been slowly rewiring itself over the course of 19 years. The process was called axonal regrowth, a phenomenon normally only seen in developing children's brains. Somehow, Terry's injured adult brain had reactivated these developmental mechanisms and spent nearly 2 decades building new neural pathways to compensate for the damaged ones. The growth must have been extraordinarily slow, happening at a glacial pace that was completely undetectable with standard medical monitoring. There was no sudden event that triggered his recovery. Instead, it was as if his brain had been working on a massive construction project for 19 years. And one day, in June 2003, enough of the infrastructure was finally complete for consciousness to come back online. When I first saw the imaging results, I spent hours poring over them with Dr. Schiff's team, trying to understand the implications. The patterns of growth were unlike anything documented in the medical literature. The white matter tracts that had formed weren't following normal developmental pathways. Instead, they appeared to have found novel routes through the damaged brain, connecting regions that don't typically communicate directly. It was as if Terry's brain had become a creative problem solver, experimenting with different connections until it found combinations that worked. What made the findings even more remarkable was that the second scan, performed 18 months after the first, showed that this neuroplasticity was ongoing. Terry's brain wasn't done healing. New connections were still forming, particularly in regions associated with motor function. This correlated with real-world improvements. Terry's family reported that he was gradually gaining more control over his limbs, though the progress was painfully slow and limited. The research team also examined another minimally conscious patient as a control subject. This patient had shown virtually no recovery over 6 years and had been scanned twice with the same 18-month interval. The comparison was striking. The control patient's brain showed no evidence of new growth or reorganization. Whatever process was happening in Terry's brain was specific to him, not a general feature of all minimally conscious patients. This raised even more questions. Why was Terry's brain capable of this remarkable reorganization when others were not? Was it something about the specific nature of his injury? Was it the constant stimulation from his devoted family? Was it genetic factors that gave his neurons greater plasticity? Or was it simply random chance, a 1-in-a-million confluence of factors that we might never be able to replicate or predict? The research coming out of Terry's case sparked intense debate in the neuroscience community. Some researchers seized on the findings as evidence that we were giving up too quickly on brain-injured patients, that we needed to provide more aggressive rehabilitation and stimulation even for those in long-term minimally conscious states. Others cautioned against over-interpreting a single case, arguing that Terry might represent a unique anomaly that doesn't generalize to other patients. I found myself somewhere in the middle of this debate, intellectually torn between hope and scientific caution. On one hand, Terry's recovery was real and documented. His brain scans provided concrete evidence of neuroplasticity that had previously been thought impossible. On the other hand, he was indeed unique. Out of hundreds of thousands of minimally conscious patients, only a tiny handful have ever shown this kind of late recovery. The odds were astronomical. But here's what kept me up at night. We don't actually know how many patients like Terry might exist. We don't have a national registry of minimally conscious patients. We don't routinely perform advanced brain imaging on long-term care patients. We don't have systematic protocols for detecting subtle improvements in awareness. How many other Terrys might be out there, their brains slowly rebuilding themselves, but nobody is looking closely enough to notice? The imaging studies from Terry's case eventually led to the development of new assessment protocols for disorders of consciousness. Researchers began using functional MRI and other advanced techniques to look for covert consciousness in seemingly unresponsive patients. They developed paradigms where patients could be asked to imagine specific activities, and their brain activation patterns could be monitored to see if they were following commands, even when they couldn't move. These studies revealed something disturbing. A significant percentage of patients diagnosed as vegetative were actually minimally conscious or even fully conscious, but unable to express it. Some estimates suggested that up to 40% of patients might be misdiagnosed. These people were aware of their surroundings, could hear conversations, could understand what was happening to them, but had no way to communicate it. They were prisoners in their own bodies, and we had been treating them as if they were unconscious. This raised profound and unsettling questions. If Terry's brain had been rebuilding itself for 19 years, when did he become conscious again? Was there a specific moment when awareness returned, or was it a gradual process? Was he partially aware for months or years before he was finally able to express it through speech? I tried asking Terry about this directly during one of my visits. I asked him if he remembered anything from the time between the accident and his awakening. He looked confused by the question. As far as his subjective experience was concerned, no time had passed at all. One moment he was in the truck with his friend, and the next moment he was in a nursing home with everyone looking much older. There was no memory of the intervening years, no sense of time passing, no awareness of the blank space in his life. But the absence of memory doesn't prove the absence of consciousness. We know from studies of anesthesia and sleep that people can be conscious without forming memories of the experience. It's possible that Terry had periods of awareness during those 19 years that he simply couldn't remember. It's possible that he heard conversations, felt sensations, experienced emotions, all without any of it being recorded in his long-term memory due to the damage to his hippocampus and frontal lobes. Even more disturbing, if we hadn't been there the day he started talking, would anyone have noticed? What if he had regained some level of consciousness but remained unable to communicate it? What if the awakening process had taken a few more years and he had died from pneumonia or another complication before his speech returned? Would we have continued to classify him as minimally conscious, never knowing that a thinking, feeling person was trapped inside that unresponsive body? Terry's case became known as the Miracle in Arkansas and attracted international media attention. But from a neuroscientific perspective, what made Terry's case truly groundbreaking was that he was the first late-recovering patient to be studied with advanced neuroimaging before and after improvements. His brain scans provided the first concrete evidence that the brain could continue to heal itself many years after injury, something we had previously believed was impossible. The research that came out of Terry's case helped establish new standards of care for patients with disorders of consciousness. It demonstrated the importance of continued stimulation and engagement, even for patients who seem unresponsive. It showed that the line between minimally conscious and vegetative states is far less clear than we thought, and it raised serious ethical questions about end-of-life decisions for brain-injured patients. Terry's recovery was not complete. He remained quadriplegic and required round-the-clock care for the rest of his life. His memory never progressed beyond 1984. He had anterograde amnesia, an inability to form new long-term memories, which meant that every day he had to be re-explained that 19 years had passed. He never fully grasped that his infant daughter was now an adult with children of her own. The anterograde amnesia was particularly cruel. Imagine waking up every morning believing it's 1984, only to be told again that you've lost 19 years of your life, that your infant daughter is now a grown woman with children, that your grandmother is dead, that your wife has moved on, that the world has changed in ways you can't comprehend. And then imagine forgetting all of that by the next morning and having to learn it all over again. Terry adapted to this reality in his own way. He developed a kind of routine, a script that his family would follow each day to help orient him. They would show him photos, explain the timeline, remind him of key events. He would accept the information with a kind of bemused confusion, make a few jokes about being Rip Van Winkle, and then carry on with his day. His personality remained largely intact, which was a mercy. His family said he was still the same Terry they remembered from before the accident, warm and funny, with a mischievous sense of humor. He loved to tease his sister, just as he always had. He maintained his love of country music and would often request specific songs from before the accident. He developed an enduring fondness for Pepsi, which became something of a running joke with the staff. No matter what else was happening, Terry could always be cheered up with a can of Pepsi. But there were also moments of profound sadness. Terry would sometimes ask about friends from his youth, not understanding why they never came to visit. He would make plans for things he wanted to do, forgetting that he was paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair. He would express excitement about seeing his baby daughter, only to be reminded that she was now in her 20s. These moments of realization, even though they wouldn't last until the next day, were heartbreaking to witness. His speech improved gradually over the months and years following his awakening. The dysarthria that had characterized his initial words became less pronounced, though it never entirely disappeared. He learned to compensate for his motor speech difficulties, developing strategies to make himself understood even when the words came out slurred. At his best, he could speak in complete sentences and express complex thoughts, though it required effort and concentration. The medical care required to keep Terry alive and comfortable was substantial. He needed assistance with all activities of daily living, feeding, bathing, dressing, and toileting. He required regular physical therapy to prevent contractures and pressure sores. His bladder and bowels needed management. He was prone to respiratory infections due to his immobility and compromised pulmonary function. Every aspect of his physical existence required careful attention and intervention. The financial burden on his family was enormous. Long-term care for a quadriplegic patient costs hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. While Terry's case attracted media attention, the family's request for help through the Terry Wallace Special Needs Trust attracted relatively few substantial contributions. The initial excitement and interest from the public faded, as it always does, and the family was left with the daily reality of caring for a severely disabled loved one. His parents, particularly his mother Angeli, bore the brunt of this responsibility. She had been visiting Terry nearly every day for 19 years during his minimally conscious state, and she continued that devotion after his awakening. She became an expert in his care, learning to read his facial expressions and vocalizations, understanding what he needed even when he couldn't articulate it clearly. She advocated fiercely for him with medical providers, insurance companies, and anyone else who needed to understand that her son was conscious and deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. But he could talk. He could laugh. He could express preferences and tell jokes. He could let his family know that he loved them. By any reasonable definition, Terry was conscious and aware in ways he hadn't been for 19 years. And for his family, after nearly 2 decades of one-sided conversations and uncertain responses, having Terry back, even in this limited capacity, was itself a kind of miracle. Terry lived for 19 more years after his awakening. He died on March 29, 2022, at the age of 57, from pulmonary complications at a long-term care facility in Searcy, Arkansas. His mother, Angeli, who had been his most devoted caregiver and advocate, had passed away 4 years earlier in 2018. After witnessing Terry's case, I fundamentally changed how I approach patients with disorders of consciousness. I became much more cautious about making definitive pronouncements about someone's level of awareness or potential for recovery. I started advocating for continued cognitive stimulation and family involvement for all my minimally conscious patients, even when conventional medical wisdom suggested it was pointless. But more than changing my medical practice, Terry's case changed me philosophically. It forced me to confront the uncomfortable reality that consciousness is far more mysterious and resilient than I had been taught. For 20 years as a neurosurgeon, I had operated with the confidence that comes from extensive training and experience. I knew what the brain could do and what it couldn't. I could look at imaging studies and predict outcomes with reasonable accuracy. Terry's case obliterated that confidence. How many other patients had I evaluated over the years and declared permanently unconscious? How many families had I counseled to withdraw care or consider long-term institutionalization based on my expert assessment that recovery was impossible? Had I been wrong about any of them? The thought keeps me awake at night. I eventually transitioned away from clinical neurosurgery and moved primarily into research and teaching. I still see patients occasionally, but I focus most of my energy on trying to understand consciousness and develop better diagnostic tools for detecting awareness in brain-injured patients. We now have functional MRI techniques that can detect covert consciousness in some patients who appear completely unresponsive. We can ask them to imagine specific tasks like playing tennis or walking through their house, and we can see the corresponding brain regions light up on the scan, proving that they understand and can follow commands, even though they can't move or speak. These advances are incredible, but they also create new ethical dilemmas. What do we do with the knowledge that some seemingly unconscious patients are actually fully aware of everything happening around them? How do we provide adequate care and quality of life for people who are conscious but have no way to express it? And how do we make end-of-life decisions when we can't be certain about someone's true level of awareness? The case of Terry Wallace remains one of the most extensively studied examples of late recovery from minimally conscious state in the medical literature. It continues to be cited in research papers, discussed at conferences, and used as a teaching case in medical schools. Dr. Schiff, who passed away recently, often said that Terry and patients like him were still teaching us about the potential of the brain to heal after severe trauma. But for me personally, Terry's case represents something beyond its scientific significance. It serves as a permanent reminder of the limitations of medical knowledge and the mysteries that still surround human consciousness. It taught me humility. It showed me that no matter how much we think we understand about the brain, there will always be cases that defy our expectations and challenge our assumptions. Terry Wallace should not have woken up. Based on every principle of neuroscience, every piece of research on traumatic brain injury, and every case study of long-term minimally conscious patients, his recovery was impossible. His brain was too severely damaged. He had been unresponsive for too long. There was no precedent, no mechanism, no explanation. But he did wake up. Against all odds, his brain found a way to rebuild itself over 19 years until consciousness could return. It's a medical phenomenon that we still don't fully understand and probably never will. The most haunting aspect of Terry's case is this. If his family hadn't been there that June morning when he said, "Mama," would anyone have noticed? How many other patients are lying in long-term care facilities right now? Their brains slowly rebuilding themselves, waiting for the day when enough connections finally form for them to say that first word. We'll probably never know. After 20 years as a neurosurgeon, after performing thousands of operations and consulting on hundreds of brain-injured patients, Terry Wallace's case remains the one that makes no sense to me. It defies explanation. It challenges everything I thought I knew about what the human brain can and cannot do. And that, more than anything else, is why I'll never forget Terry Wayne Wallace. He proved that even after 2 decades of training and practice, even with all our advanced technology and scientific understanding, the human brain can still surprise us in ways we never imagined possible. He showed us that consciousness is more resilient, more mysterious, and more miraculous than we ever dared to believe. Terry's legacy isn't just in the research papers or the textbooks. It's in the fundamental humility that his case demands from every neurologist and neurosurgeon who learns about it. It's a reminder that we should never be too confident in our pronouncements about what is possible or impossible when it comes to the human brain. Because sometimes, after 19 years of silence, a patient says one word that changes everything we thought we knew.